Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video in this beginner Python series. If you didn't catch my previous video on variables, I'll leave a link down below. In this video, we'll be talking about basic numeric data types in Python. So data types in general are just a classification of data items, such as strings, integers, floats, and so on. In this video, I'll be using Google Colab for my code editor. You can find it just by Googling Google Colab. I'll also leave a link down below in the description. The first numeric data type we'll be talking about is the integer, or int for short. An integer is just any positive or negative whole number. For example, 21, 7, negative 23, negative 19, basically any number without a decimal. Alright, so let's take a look at an example of an integer. So first I'm going to create a variable. Let's call it x. And let's assign it to an integer value of, let's say 5. And remember, you're free to name your variables pretty much anything you want. But it's always good practice to name your variables something descriptive to what you're trying to do with it. So now that I have my variable created, I can pass it into my print function and print what's stored inside of my variable. In this case, we should get the integer value of 5. But how can we really be sure that this number 5 is actually an integer? Well, in the last video we mentioned that any value surrounded by quotes is a string. But notice that our number 5 isn't surrounded by quotes. But we still want to be 100% sure. So what we can do is pass our variable into a built-in function called type. Notice how the x goes into the parentheses. This function will output the data type of our variable, which as you can see is type int. It's always a good idea to check for yourself what the data type is for the data you're working with. This is especially useful when you're doing more complex projects and are expecting specific data types. Remember, an integer is just any whole number, positive or negative. Alright, so now that we've spoken about the integer, let's take a look at another numeric data type called the float or floating point number. A float is basically any number that contains a decimal point. So for example, 3.14, 1.5, negative 2.6, or negative 3.2, any number with a decimal point. So let's create a variable. Let's call it y. And let's assign it to the value 2.5. So we know that any number with a decimal point is a float. But let's be 100% sure. Let's pass our variable into the type function. So remember, our variable y is going into these parentheses. And as you can see, what we get in return, the output is a float. Something else we can do with this is we can take our values and we can convert them between each other, which is going to be very useful later on. So how do we do this? Well, for example, let's say I take my y variable, which is a float, and I pass it into a function called int. What do you think it'll do? Take a second, think about it. If I pass in a float into a function called int, what do you think it will do? Leave a comment down below. What do you think it's going to do? Well, how this function actually works is that it will try to convert whatever is inside of the parentheses into an integer value. So if I run this and I pass in my variable y, notice how my output is just the value 2. The int function basically removes the value after the decimal point and only returns the whole number part. This is called lossy conversion, since there was a loss of data. There are ways around this, which we'll talk about in another video. For now, we're going to keep it simple. We can also do the opposite. We can convert from an integer into a float. So let's go back to our x variable, which is storing the value 5, which remember was an integer. And let's pass it into a function called float. we're placing our variable x into a float function. So what do you think it's going to do? Let's run it and let's find out. So notice how the float function adds a decimal point after our whole number, followed by a 0. Being able to convert between different data types is going to be extremely valuable later on. For now, we're just keeping it simple. All right, so one last thing before we go. What do you think will happen if we were to, let's say, add an integer and a float together? What kind of data type do you think the output would be? Would it be a float? Would it be an integer? What do you think? Leave a comment down below with what you think the output would be. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It's much appreciated and will help the channel to grow. All right everyone, thanks again and until next time.